On a February evening in 1989, Soviet television was broadcasting something completely ordinary, a scheduled poetry reading, live, from Almaty. The poet reading his own verse was a well-known literary figure named Olzhas Suleimenov. And partway through, without warning, he stopped reading poetry. He looked into the camera and started talking about something else entirely, about radioactive gas venting from underground tests at a military site hundreds of kilometers away. Tests the public was never supposed to hear about at all. Live, uncut, unscripted, on state television, in a country where that kind of statement could end a career, or worse. By the time the broadcast ended, he had called on people to gather 2 days later at the Writers' Union. He had no idea in that moment that he was about to help end one of the largest weapons testing programs on Earth. But to understand why that moment mattered, you have to go back 40 years, to the machine his words were aimed at. In August 1949, in a stretch of empty steppe in northeastern Kazakhstan, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, codename RDS-1. Roughly the same size as the bomb dropped on Nagasaki 4 years earlier. It caught the West completely by surprise, and it started an arms race that would define the rest of the century. The place where it happened had a name that gave almost nothing away: the Semipalatinsk Test Site. Locals just called it the Polygon. Over the next 40 years, the Soviet Union detonated bombs there 456 times, some underground, some dropped from aircraft, some hung from towers and simply exploded in open air, close enough to the ground for the fallout to go exactly where the wind decided to take it. And the wind, more than once, took it toward people. The Polygon sat right next to inhabited land, villages, farms, a city of tens of thousands. Soviet planners knew this. They tested there anyway. Of the hundreds of tests, a handful did most of the damage. The single largest, in raw destructive terms, came in August 1953. The Soviet Union's first hydrogen bomb, 400 kilotons, roughly 20 times the size of the bomb that leveled Hiroshima. But the test that hurt the most people directly happened 3 years later, on August 24, 1956. A 27-kiloton device, small by the Polygon standards, detonated under weather conditions nobody accounted for. The fallout cloud didn't stay on the test range. It drifted toward the industrial city of Ust-Kamyenogorsk, tens of thousands of people going about an ordinary Friday. According to a report written at the time by Soviet military doctors, a document that stayed classified for almost 60 years, 638 people were hospitalized with acute radiation sickness in the days that followed. When that report eventually surfaced decades later, one science journalist compared the number to Chernobyl, where a confirmed 134 people were diagnosed with the same condition. The comparison isn't a settled scientific fact. It comes from a single archive, and the two counts weren't measured the same way. But even without the comparison, 600 people with radiation sickness from one test in one afternoon is not a small accident. It's a mass casualty event. The government's public explanation at the time was nothing. There wasn't one. The following year, 1957, a new medical facility opened in the region. Its sign read, Anti-Brucellosis Dispensary No. 4. Brucellosis is a real disease, a bacterial infection common in livestock regions like this one, and on paper, the clinic was there to fight it. It wasn't. Internally, it was classified top secret, run under Moscow's Institute of Biophysics, and its actual job was to quietly track the long-term health of people living closest to the test site, tens of thousands of them, in a study that would run for decades. Patients who came in with radiation-related symptoms weren't told that. A Kazakh physician working at the time later described watching Moscow specialists write down other explanations instead. Vitamin deficiency, ordinary illness, for conditions the doctors on the ground suspected were something else entirely. The real findings went into a separate set of records, and those records went to Moscow, not to the patients. The clinic still exists today, in a different form, reorganized after the Soviet collapse into a public research institute that studies radiation health. Its own website doesn't hide that its predecessor operated in secret. It just doesn't dwell on what that secrecy actually cost the people it was studying. The Polygon closed in 1991. But radiation doesn't check a closure decree. The cost of 40 years of testing didn't end with the last explosion. It kept arriving, one birth at a time, for the generation that came after. In a village not far from the test site, a boy was born in 1968 with no arms. His name is Karipbek Kuyukov. He grew up and he learned to paint, holding the brush in his mouth or between his toes. Decades later, he stood in front of the United Nations General Assembly in New York and spoke in person about growing up as living evidence of what the tests did to people who were never at war with anyone. He's not the only one. A young woman named Diana, born generations after the last test, lives with a neurological condition her family traces to the same exposure. A man named Dmitry, third generation, was born with a bone disorder officially linked to radiation his grandparents absorbed before he existed. Kazakhstan's own government estimates well over 1 million people carry some connection to what happened at the Polygon. None of them detonated a single bomb. All of them are still paying for the ones that were. Which brings us back to that February evening in 1989. Olzhas Suleimenov wasn't a scientist, or a victim, or a soldier. He was a poet, famous enough in Kazakhstan to have a live television slot and running at that moment for a seat in the Soviet Union's first semi-democratic parliament. When he broke from his script to talk about radioactive venting from recent tests, he wasn't revealing the secret clinic or the 1956 disaster. Most people watching had never heard of either. He was doing something simpler and in its way just as dangerous, telling millions of people live that the testing happening near their homes was still going on, right now, and that no one had asked them if that was acceptable. 2 days later, several thousand people showed up at the Writers' Union in Almaty, the meeting he'd called for on air. Within days, a petition demanding an end to testing had gathered more than 1 million signatures. By August, tens of thousands rallied at a volcano outside the city. The movement took its name from an American counterpart, Nevada, Semipalatinsk. 2 test sites, 1 campaign. It worked faster than almost anyone expected. The Soviet government suspended testing that same August. The very last test at the Polygon happened that October. And on August 29, 1991, the exact calendar date 42 years earlier that RDS-1 had first gone off, Kazakhstan's president signed the decree that closed the site for good. Today, part of the old test site is open, cautiously, with radiation meters, to researchers and the occasional visitor. Other parts were quietly closed off again in recent years. The roads back to where the first bomb went off aren't open to the public anymore. The city built to house the scientists who ran the Polygon still stands. It once held 40,000 people. Today it holds a fraction of that, a research town slowly becoming a memory of itself. In nearby Semey, there's a monument called Stronger Than Death. Every August 29th, people still gather there. Karipbek Kuyukov still paints and still travels, telling the same story to whatever room will listen. The institute built from that old secret clinic still operates, openly now, still studying the same population. Nobody detonates bombs there anymore, but the accounting for the 456 that already went off, the exact number of lives shortened, changed, or born already altered, was never really finished. It just stopped being secret.